Welcome to Maybe Someday. This is the DollyZoomerang.
This is by far our most anticipated video, and by that I mean it's our only ever anticipated video, but a lot of people asked for it, so I'm really excited to finally share it with you guys. It's basically just an amalgamation of a few different filmmaking techniques, but when you mash them all together, it makes something that's kind of new and that I think is pretty cool. So let's just jump into it. The more obvious technique we're using here is called the dolly zoom. This technique is often used in movies to give a sort of vertigo effect, and it's done by physically moving the camera toward or away from the subject while simultaneously zooming in or out. Now you see it has a great video that goes into a lot of detail on that, so I'm not going to bother explaining it too much, but I'll put a link below in the description. Then we're just mashing this with a boomerang effect, which pretty much everyone is familiar with, where you essentially just reverse the clip at the end of a moment and then loop the action over and over. I'm sure I'm not the first person that's done this, but I searched the hashtag and nobody's used it yet, so I'm totally claiming it. So what you're going to need is a half-decent camera that shoots crispy 4K, so not this one. And then in my case I have a one wheel, so I can use that in conjunction with a Movi Pro and a 4K camera to get buttery smooth dolly movement towards my subject. But if you don't have a fancy gimbal and or a one wheel, you can always go handheld in a rolly chair and get your friend to push you around. But if you don't have a friend, you can do it with a stills camera. You take the photo, move the camera a little bit, take the photo, move the camera a little bit, kind of like a hyperlapse. And then failing all else, you can always go with a drone. So if your camera will shoot 60 frames per second in 4K, I like to do that. It's not mandatory, but it just gives you some extra frames for stabilization, and it also helps with the ramping at the ends of the clip. The reason you need it to be 4K though is because, for simplicity's sake, we're not going to be optically zooming the image. We'd have the resolution, and if it's just going on Instagram, the quality would be suitable to digitally zoom up to around 300 or 400%. So if you want to get crazy and try and pull off a legit dolly zoom, you can definitely give that a shot, but for today, I'm going to teach you how to do it digitally. So when I'm doing these, I'm literally just moving toward and away from my subject as smooth as possible, and then I do the rest in post. Okay, so we jump into Premiere and we load our footage in here, and then we find the part of the clip that we want to use, and in my case it's almost always the very last take. So we'll set an in point right at the very beginning of our last take, and then we'll move to the end where it stops, set an out point, and then we just drag this into our sequence, and it'll create a new sequence if we don't have one already, using the settings from the clip, which is what we want. The next thing we want to do is kind of pre-speed this clip up, so and I'll explain why in a moment, but ideally you want this duration before you do your speed ramping to land somewhere between 5 seconds and maybe 8 to 10 seconds, so somewhere in that window. So let's try 200, and yep, 200, that gets us at 7 seconds, so that's pretty good. Hit OK. And then we give ourselves some room here for some keyframing. Go to show clip keyframes, time remapping, speed. And then I'm going to drag this down to about 20% just so our beginning and end of our buffer is nice and slow. Go over about 8 frames or so, add a keyframe. Go to the end of our clip, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And add another keyframe here. And then we'll speed this up to 1000% because that's the max we can go. And the reason we had to do this pre-speed up thing is because you can only drag this up to 1000, and in most cases you're going to want that to be more than 1000. So I don't know why Premiere doesn't let you drag that higher, but for whatever reason it doesn't. So now we're going to give ourselves a nice little speed ramp action here. And there's no real science to this, it's just kind of a bit of trial and error and seeing kind of what works and what doesn't work. You can copy what I'm doing exactly if you want, or you can just play around with your own clip. The main thing you need to know is that by the end of this ramp here, you want your clip to be stopped. So here we're a little bit too soon, so let's go to maybe back like a second or so. Maybe we're on there and see where that lands. And yeah, so we come to a complete stop right about there. That's perfect. So we'll do a little blade action there. And then we're gonna Bezier these, so they get nice smooth acceleration through the speed ramp. And then just play it back and see how it looks. So yeah, it looks pretty good to me, and the more you do these, the more you'll kind of start to notice what works and what doesn't. Now the next thing we need to do before we can go on is nest this. So we're going to call this A01 speed ramped. Just so if I have to go back, I know which nests are what. Now that we've nested this, we can do some playing around with our effect controls. So in the case of this one, because I started further back and I went forward, I'm going to go to the end of the clip, so the last frame, which is always, if you hit end of the frame, you got to go back one. Click on here, and I'm going to lock the position and scale. So whenever your camera is closest to your subject, that's where you want to lock the position and scale first, so that it maintains, so that's 100 essentially, that's your neutral ground. And then you got to go back to the beginning of the clip where we're the furthest away, and we'll start doing our zoom in. And now because we shot this 4K, in theory we can go up to about 400% without losing too much quality. In practice, but I mean this is for Instagram, so I'm not too worried about it. And then we'll reframe things so we get things kind of nice and centered how they were at the end of the frame. And then a way you can test to see if this is working is if you go to the end of your shot and then you go to the beginning of your shot, you want your subject to be more or less the same size in both frames. Even though the rest of the frame is doing all kinds of funky stuff, you want your subject to be the same size, more or less. So that's looking pretty good to me. But now if we watch the movement back, you'll see that there's some funky stuff happening with the zoom. And that's because these are linear, they're not Bezier curves. So the quickest way to do that is to just go into your temporal interpolation and ease out of the first one, and then go into your last two here and ease in. And then it still kind of does some weird stuff here with some wobbles, which I kind of like, but this is a little too much. So I usually play around with where these are placed. And in most cases, going back one frame over seems to do the trick. Let's just see how that looks. Yeah, we might go a little more. The other thing you can do is play with your keyframes here and drag these out a little bit to kind of see what matches until it's looking nice. Now that's pretty close, and there's still a little bit of wobbliness happening, but you know what, I'm okay with that because the next step is probably going to fix that. So now that we're pretty happy with that, dolly zooming, we're going to right click on this, we're going to nest this, we're going to call it A02 dolly zoomed with 3 O's of course. And now that we've dolly zoomed it, we can go to our effects panel, we can warp stabilize this thing. Now if you shot this with a gimbal, you're probably only going to need 3 to 5% smoothness, but if you did this handheld or with a tripod or something, you're going to want to go up a little higher. So it's just a matter again of trial and error, seeing what works, and we'll see how that turned out. And you know what, I'm pretty happy with that actually. So just evens things out and smooths out the movement a little bit and adds a little bit of an elastic feel to it. So of course, now that we've done another effect to this, we're going to have to nest this one last time. A03 stabilized. And now that we've nested that, we're not worried about screwing any frames up. We can copy this and paste it, and then we can go to speed duration, and just like when you're making a boomerang, you just hit reverse, and now you have your forward one and your backward one. So sometimes you'll want to play around with like trimming frames off the beginning or the end if there's a little bit too much, but in this case I'm pretty happy with it. What I do now before I add the music is I'll copy this one bar, so to speak, and I'll paste 3 more, so we have 4 total. And the reason I use 4 is because most of the music that you're probably going to use is going to be 4/4 time. So if you have 4 loops of the section and you grab one little section of the song, then you can usually time things out really well to a 4/4 beat. So I've already kind of selected a part of the song that I think is going to work really well for this, and we'll drag that onto our timeline. For music, I tend to find that stuff that doesn't have a distracting melody but has a really distinct beat works really well, and I find that finger snaps also tend to lend themselves really well to the effect. So as you can see, this section of the music, which should loop perfectly, is a little bit longer than what the actual clip is. So because I know this is landing at 10 seconds, I'm going to right click on the music track, speed duration, set this to match the same as the video layer, and I'm going to maintain the audio pitch because I kind of like this song as it is. Hit OK, and now the music track lines up perfectly with the visuals. So let's take a look. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. So the very last thing we can do is throw a quick little grade on here. So we're not going to go into color grading. This isn't a color grading tutorial, but I'll put a link below to a website where you can get some amazing LUTs that'll change your color grading game. In this case, I'll just quickly slap something on here. Cool. It's got kind of like a funky vintage vibe. Kind of works for this. So once you're happy with that, you can, if you want to double check that it's going to be a hashtag perfect loop on Instagram, you can just pop that like that, and then, yeah, that works pretty good. But because we want this to be short and sweet and loopable, we're going to keep that at the 10-second mark. We're going to export it, and I'm not going to get into my export settings because John Simo did an amazing job of figuring out the best export settings for Instagram, so I'll put a link to that in the description below, and you can check that out for exporting. And that's basically the post-production side of things. I was kind of intentional about only putting a few examples in here, even though I've shot dozens of them by now, because mostly I'm excited to see what you guys do with it. So get out there and have fun and experiment with it, and when you post them, use the hashtag DollyZoomerang so that I can see them and see what you guys have done. And I can't stress enough that you don't need to have super fancy equipment to pull this off. I've already been tagged in a couple, like this one, where you can tell it was just done handheld, but the effect really works. So don't get too hung up on not having the right gear and just go out and see what happens. If you did like this video, I would love it if you gave it a thumbs up. It means a lot. And if you're new here, why don't you subscribe and then go check out some of our older videos while you wait for the next one. Until then, see you later.